To the best of my knowledge, this happened on November 3rd, 1980. Rita Kruger, who was a single lady living in Brentwood at the time, owned mining claims in the top of Pleasant Canyon. Each year, when she came out for a week to do her assessment work, I would take her up to her cabin and bring her back down to catch the bus for home. The day of the murder, I had to work, so we got a late start. My oldest son, John, who was 7 years old, was with us. He often went to the hills with Dad. I had to work the next day, so I was in a hurry and had the pedal to the metal. It was just turning dark enough to need the headlights as I entered the narrows of Pleasant Canyon. The road in those days was in a lot better shape than it is now, so I was at the gate in just a few minutes. Back then, the gate at the bottom of Clare Camp was locked and I had a key, courtesy of Bob Clare, having known him for years. I unlocked the gate and left it open because I was in a hurry. As we pulled through the camp, we noticed a faint light to the south in Gary Clare's old cabin. It was the green one, uphill on the south, next to the white one, which was Grandma Clare's cabin. As we reached the upper end of the camp, we were looking to the right for the turn in the road near Jim Clare's old cabin. We cut across and pulled up by a little Datsun pickup sporting a camper shell and Arizona license plates. As I stepped out, a man came up out of the greasewoods below me, stopping about 4 feet away. He was shaking and hollering. "How did you get in here?" As he pointed a cut-down semi-automatic rifle at my stomach. Needless to say, I didn't think this was a very good situation. I told him, "Hey, it's okay. I have a key to the gate," and introduced myself as Bill Gossett, a friend of the Clares. Rita got out and started talking too. With the two of us talking to him and telling him that we hadn't seen anyone, he seemed to calm down some. He introduced himself as Harold and said that he was the caretaker. We told him we pulled over because we saw the light and thought we'd find Bob Clare there since he told us he was going to be the caretaker. Like a bunch of fools, we followed him into the cabin when he invited us. It's obvious now that he wanted more information from us. The cabin was dimly lit in the far western end by a sooty kerosene lamp. We sat down and the direction of the conversation went right back to whether we'd seen anybody or anything. Again, we told him no. Harold told me that he hadn't been himself that day. It was obvious to me that he had probably been drinking and using some drugs. When I asked him what kind of rifle he was carrying, all he would say was, "Special make." He wouldn't hand it over for me to look at. As we were sitting there, he got out a large knife and started opening and closing it. My boy was standing next to me, approximately 4 to 5 feet from Harold, who was sitting on a bed to the north. To the left of John and me was a door to the outside, and Rita was to my right. Out of the blue, Harold inquired, "Do you have a gun?" By this time, you'd have to be awful stupid to not know that you were in some kind of bad situation. I answered him saying, "I always carry one." And he didn't know the difference since it was a cool evening and I was wearing an old army jacket. I could sense that he immediately got more nervous and then asked if the boy wanted to sit by him. John said no, and I said we needed to get going. We all got up to leave. Rita went first, then John. Harold invited me to go ahead of him, but I said no. "You go ahead first." As I took up the rear, I knew something was wrong, and I wasn't going to have him walking right behind me. When we got outside, he asked if he could ride up canyon with us, and still not knowing the depth of the situation, we said yes. The boy rode in the back. Rita slid over into the center and Harold rode shotgun. As we started back across the camp heading north, I flipped the switch and turned on the 385,000 candle power off-road lights that were mounted on the grill guard of the trusty old Scout. By the way, yeah, I had a gun. It was in the glove box. It's a good thing he didn't know that. As we were heading north on the road across from the upper part of camp, Harold, knowing what I was going to see, started saying, You know where to turn? You gotta turn right here. You know you gotta turn, right? He did a fantastic job of keeping our attention diverted. As soon as we turned right and headed uphill, he said, "That's all right. I changed my mind. I'll get out of here." As we drove off, I asked Rita, "What do you think is going on here? Something's wrong with this situation." She said that she thought the Herald was acting awful weird also, but we decided that he was probably just a weirdo. At that, I kicked the old scout in the butt and made up for some lost time. I pulled up to Rita's cabin and dropped her off along with her gear, then headed back down the canyon. I had the place really lit up with the daylighters, and as I came into the upper end of the Clare camp, John said, "Daddy, there's a dead man by the road." I slammed the brakes on, stopping about 25 feet short of where the body lay, told John to stay put, and got out my gun. I still wasn't sure what the situation was and thought that something might have happened to Harold. I got out, took a look, standing in the lights like an idiot, and realized that the person lying there wasn't Harold. And without a doubt, this guy was dead. I ran out to the lights, grabbed a flashlight, and called out Harold's name several times. He didn't answer. I shined the light and could see that the small truck with the camper shell was still over by Gary Clare's cabin. I now knew why Harold was acting so strange, and figured that the best thing I could do was immediately go for help, since he didn't have a clue where Rita was. I figured I would be ambushed somewhere in the camp as I drove through and expected the gate to be shut, which would make the perfect spot for it. I told John to get down on the front floorboard and stay put until I told him different. I said, "If you hear shooting and something happens to Dad, you jump out and run up the mountainside and hide. Don't show your face until it's daylight and you see a sheriff." I went down through the camp with one hand on the wheel and a pistol in the other. As I approached the gate, I found that it was open just as I had left it. Lucky break. I hit the accelerator and let the old scout rip down the canyon at warp speed. I stopped at Ballarat and talked to the caretaker since the Jones weren't there. I told them that there had been a murder in Pleasant Canyon, and told him that if anyone came out, to watch and see which way they went. I put the pedal down and headed the scout toward Trona. As I was heading toward Slate Range Crossing, I spotted a quarry truck making the long pull up the grade. I got him to stop, thinking there was a chance that his FM radio would reach Trona. It did, after trying somewhat unsuccessfully over the radio to get the West End security guard to try to understand where Panamint Valley was, let alone Ballarat or Pleasant Canyon. The security guard called the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department. The telephone was placed by the radio, and I was able to talk to them and let them know what was going on. I headed on toward Trona, and as I passed the Homewood Canyon turnoff, I saw flashing lights coming my way. It was Deputy Norris Jones and Sergeant Vern Smith from the Trona Sheriff's substation. I filled them in with the details and told them I would meet them at the Ballarat Monument and headed on into Trona. As I pulled into the yard, my wife was already outside with that huge look of concern mixed with relief. Someone had already heard it on the plant radio and had called her. I told her what was going on, left John with her, and went down to the gas station to fuel up. As I pulled in, I noticed a highway patrol car getting fuel. As I pumped gas into the Scout, I told them who I was and what was happening. They told me that they had gotten the call and were headed out to Panamint Valley too. I gave them some details and they took off. I topped off the tank, paid the bill, and headed out, really letting the Scout get it on. After I went over Slate Range, I headed down the straight stretch. The speedometer was buried on the 120 mark. That's as far as it would go. I was flying through the dips and curves at the bottom when all of a sudden, I was right on top of them. I had caught up with the CHP. I had so much momentum that I couldn't do anything but pass them. I pulled into the Ballarat turnoff as prearranged, figuring the CHP would write me a ticket when they got there, but they never said a word. We were discussing the details of what had transpired when Sergeant Smith decided that it would be best to move down to Ballarat and wait there for a 4x4 from Inyo County to arrive. Everyone there knew the details of what had gone on so far. At that time, other than myself, there were 6 law enforcement officers and the quarry truck driver who was there for the use of his radio since the sheriff's radios wouldn't get out of Panamint Valley. When we had been in Ballarat about 30 minutes, in the dark with no lights whatsoever, and everyone was being pretty quiet when all of a sudden, Deputy Norris Jones said, "Do you hear that?" Everyone listened intently and we could hear it. Something was moving toward us, stepping on the gravel. You could distinctly hear footsteps. The next thing I could remember was the click, click, click of the automatic weapons. Flashlights and spotlights lit up the area. Standing in the middle of the Pleasant Canyon dirt road, about 60 yards out, was a man with a large coat. Law enforcement hollered repeatedly for him to get on the ground. He was defiant. After what seemed like an eternity, but in reality was probably only 60 seconds, Sergeant Smith at the Trona Sheriff's substation ran around the south side and came up behind Harold. He grabbed him in a headlock, which I thought was just about crazy, because I had just looked at the young deputy who was leaning over the trunk of a patrol car by me, with his finger shaking like crazy on the trigger of a fully automatic weapon, loaded with a large clip of ammo. As he struggled to pull him down, several deputies rushed forward to assist, and I went with them. When they had pinned him to the ground, out of the jacket came one hand holding the cut-down rifle, special make. In the other hand, he held the large knife he had been opening and closing back in the cabin. He had a long coat, and when they opened it, there was a very small dog inside. Who would have expected that? They searched him thoroughly and pulled out a wallet with the victim's ID and money, as well as a bread bag containing marijuana. When they had him in the back of one of the squad cars, I walked up and took a good look at him with his coat off. I noticed that he had a large cut on his forehead. He was adamantly denying any knowledge of any murder and saying that he had fallen and hit his head, which started me thinking that maybe I had screwed up and that it was this guy that had been lying beside the road up in the canyon. I ran the details through my mind again and came up with no way Jose. It couldn't have been him. About that time, 2 more Inyo County deputies showed up with a 4x4. After we filled them in on the details, I climbed into the vehicle and rode with them back up the canyon. When we got into the Narrows, there was a shirt lying in the water. We stopped and looked at it. It was covered in blood. We drove further into the Narrows, and in a ditch on the high side, we found the little Datsun pickup. Someone had been driving it out fast, crashed into a ditch and blown out a tire. The windshield was busted where someone's head had hit it, and there was blood all over the inside of the truck. It was starting to make sense. We drove up onto the Clare camp and the victim was there beside the road. Just as I had described, we all carefully got out, the deputies using large flashlights to check for evidence. One thing they noticed right off was a pair of crushed glasses lying in the road, not far from the victim. I had driven over them. The deputies made a radio call down to the others in Ballarat and confirmed there had in fact been a murder. They were told to secure the scene until daylight when the investigators and coroner would come up. With lots of time on our hands, we sat and waited in the sheriff's Jeep Wagoneer. The deputies, having nothing else going on, decided that I should write out a report of what all had happened. I hate paperwork and was full of reasons why I shouldn't have to. It was quiet except for the sound of a dog barking in the distance, when all of a sudden one of the deputies said, "Do you hear that?" We all listened intently. We could hear it. Something or someone was moving around on the rocks in the distance and was coming toward us slowly and carefully. I said to the deputy behind the wheel, "Give me a gun." To which he replied, "I can't do that." I said thanks a lot for nothing and sat there feeling vulnerable. They both got their flashlights and weapons out. One deputy had a shotgun and one had a sidearm. They decided that on the count of 3 they would dive out to the vehicle, one on each side, and illuminate whoever or whatever was approaching. The deputies were getting nervous as the sound slowly but steadily got closer. One of them started to count. 1, 2. On 3 they dove. The next thing I heard was, "Oh hell, it's just a damn jackass." As the deputies were getting up and brushing themselves off, I turned and looked. There was an old burro, just wanting to get by us. The burro was probably thinking, "What in the hell are you fools doing out here in the middle of the night?" We all had a laugh about it, which was a little bit of a stress breaker. It had been a long night when finally I convinced the deputies that nobody was going to compromise their crime scene at that hour, and that they should take me back down to Ballarat to my vehicle. If I remember correctly, I arrived in Ballarat at about 3:30 in the morning. Boy, was I tired, and I still had to drive to Trona. I had to be at work at 7 a.m. I don't recall whether I got the drop of sleep or not. Probably not. 2 days later, I saw Deputy Jones, and he filled me in on what had transpired since that night. On the previous afternoon, a young man was brought into the Trona substation, where he told an interesting story. I don't remember his name. I only remember parts of a story I was told. On the day of the murder, he and his friend had traveled up Pleasant Canyon in that small Datsun pickup. When they arrived at the gate, they met Harold, began talking with him, and gave him a ride up the canyon to the Stone Corral. That was about 3 miles above Clare Camp, and then back. The Stone Corral is where the Death Valley Park boundary is today. In the process, they had smoked some pot with him. When they returned to Clare Camp and were gathering their things together and preparing to leave, Harold approached them. He pointed the gun at the soon-to-be victim and said, "Give me your money." When the guy hesitated, Harold pulled the trigger. The victim went down, and his companion, fearing for his life, headed up the south hillside and into the rocks. This all happened right at dusk. Harold, having a jammed rifle and realizing that the man he'd shot wasn't dead, jumped on top of him and finished the job by beating him to death with a large rock. When he was done, he got up and looked around. Not able to see the victim's companion anywhere, he started shouting,
"Aw, come back. I won't hurt you. I'm sorry."
Just then, he heard the engine from an approaching vehicle. Within moments, lights were visible at the gate. The lights were ours. When we pulled over to the cabin, it was dark enough that the guy on the mountainside couldn't see clearly what was going on. He could only make out muffled voices and see people enter the cabin. You can imagine just how scared he was at that time, thinking that the people arriving on the scene were possibly reinforcements coming to help Harold find and kill him. As I understand it, while we were at the cabin, he started working his way up the canyon. When he got into the vehicle and started heading up the canyon, he hid, thinking that we were looking for him. I understand that during the night, he hiked to the top of the canyon where he spent a very cold night. The next morning, he hiked north across the ridge and down Happy Canyon. On the afternoon of the second day, he was picked up from the side of the road in Panamint Valley and given a ride to the Trona Sheriff's substation, where he proceeded to tell his story. Harold Edward Norton, which was an AKA for Laird Stankwitz, was held pending trial in Independence in Inyo County for the murder of Richard Burrell of Woodland Hills. I had to appear twice as a witness at the trial. There was some discussion about having our 7-year-old son be a witness as well. When Barb objected, stating that he was only 7 years old and was already having nightmares, the DA said that if he needed to, he could subpoena him through her. She was dead set against it and mad as hell, but it turned out that they were able to handle it without him, so all was well in her world. Poor John. It seemed that if his dad was going to find a body, he was doomed to be there too. It hadn't been that long since they had come upon another body near Tin Mountain in Death Valley, but that's another story. At the trial, I got to look at the rifle and I could see how bad it had jammed. He had taken the large knife and tried to dig the shell out, which tore a lot of the back of the shell off. I now believe that while we were sitting in that cabin with him, he was probably wondering whether or not he could take me, because it appeared at that time his mind was doing funny things. Sometimes he seemed okay, sometimes he didn't. Mostly he didn't. Laird Stankwitz was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. His sentence was overturned by California Supreme Court Justice Rosebird, and he was given a life sentence. He died in prison years ago. I heard through the grapevine that Laird found religion and made peace with God while in prison. I hope so. Rita Kruger later met and married John Nickel, who is now 94 and still going strong. He runs a D8 dozer, and together they are still in the mining business. John is 30 years old now and spends a lot of time boondocking, just like his dad. And as for Barb and I, we spend as much time as we can exploring.